Hiya folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness, joining me for another episode of Strange Tales. Today I'm going to be talking about Steven Spielberg, specifically his film E.T. from 1982, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about Close Encounters of the Third Kind before I do that. And the reason why I'm going to do it is because these two films are about the possibility of extraterrestrial life visiting the Earth. And the first of these films, 1977's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was a film that ruffled a few feathers in the establishment. Spielberg was considered at the time to be something of an anti-Hollywood establishment film director. He was scorned by many insiders in the industry for being unorthodox in his production approach to films. And at the time, he had a pro-ET UFO stance. At least it appeared overtly that way. In the 1977 documentary UFOs Are Here, which was directed by Guy Baskin, Spielberg said this on the matter: "I wouldn't put it past this government that a cosmic Watergate has been underway for the last 25 years. At the same time, from the government's point of view, we're still growing up, and eventually they might want to tell us something about what they've discovered over the decades." So, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the main character, Roy Neary, is played by Richard Dreyfuss. And for those people who are interested in the matter, Richard Dreyfuss has a noted Freemason. It's documented in many, many places. But the character, Roy Neary, he is an ordinary working class man. He has a late night encounter with a craft from another world. And Neary's encounter leads him to knowledge being implanted in his mind. And his knowledge leads him to a location where ETs ultimately land, make full and open contact with humans, and they want to take somebody back with them, and there's a team of scientists and engineers and those type who are going to go with them. The aliens choose to take Roy Neary with them. There are some positive messages in the film. The story also includes a subplot about federal government involvement with the cover-up, cooperation with the military as well, and they use every attempt to deny, debunk, cover up. They use intimidation, they use fear, they use outright lies at some points in the film, and the evidence. So basically what they're trying to do is block evidence of the ETs from the main population in order to control the nature of the eventual contact with humanity in the film. And Spielberg asked the US Air Force for help in the production of the film at the time, but he was turned down on the grounds that, quote, "the military did not support the existence of UFOs." And there was this letter from the US Air Force to Columbia Pictures dated 1976. Major Sidney Shaw of the National Guard Bureau of Washington, D.C. replied, taken from Gail Heathwood's Steven Spielberg Cinema Papers 1978. "We have reviewed the script and believe it would be inappropriate for the Air Force or National Guard Bureau to support the production. In 1969, the US Air Force completed a study which concluded that there is no evidence concerning the existence of UFOs. We have not been involved in UFOs since that study, other than answering queries about the study. The proposed film leaves the distinct impression that UFOs in fact do exist. It also involves the government and the military in a big cover-up of the existence of UFOs. These 2 points are counter to Air Force and Department of Defense policy and make support to the production inappropriate." And that's happened quite a bit in Hollywood. There's a great book called Operation Hollywood by David L. Robb. Documents a lot of that in there, specifically when Dee Devlin was trying to get help from the US military to make Independence Day. Same reasons. They didn't like the way the military was portrayed in the film, so they turned down the offer. Where that film was concerned, they asked if they could change the script. They did say, "We would be involved if you can change the script." The things that they wanted removing from the film were references to the Roswell incident and Area 51, and they actually went out of their way to remove them from the script, but the military still didn't want to be involved even after that, so make of that what you will. But Steven Spielberg's experiences with the military didn't stop him from attempting to secure assistance from the establishment. He approached NASA and asked for their involvement in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They replied with a 20-page letter. I'm going to read some of it out for you. And they asked him not to make the film at all because they were worried that the film would incite hysteria. And Spielberg believed, quoted again from Gail Heathwood's Steven Spielberg Cinema Papers 1978, "If NASA took the time to write me a 20-page letter, then I know there must be something happening. When they read the script, they got very angry and felt that it was a film that would be dangerous. I felt they mainly wrote the letter because Jaws convinced so many people around the world that there were sharks in toilets and bathtubs, not just in the oceans and rivers. They were afraid the same kind of epidemic would happen with UFOs." There's one final curious note about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It pertains to this rumour that persisted throughout the production of the film. And according to one of the film's actors, Bob Balaban, in his 1998 book, Close Encounters of the Third Kind Diary, the rumour was that The film is part of a necessary training that the human race must go through in order to accept an actual landing, and is being secretly sponsored by a government UFO agency. And it's also worth pointing you to an excellent book called Silver Screen Saucers by Robbie Graham. It's an excellent book, it's really worth checking out. And Robbie Graham actually contacted the film's production designer, Joe Alves, about that rumour, and apparently he replied, "There were a lot of rumours," and then changed the subject. So make of that what you will. So we jump now to 1982, and Spielberg further cemented his interest in the possibility of ET life by releasing ET the Extra Terrestrial. And it's a story about a stranded alien botanist who makes contact with this little boy called Elliot. And Spielberg stated that he'd actually written the fictional story based on a number of various ET UFO accounts that had been told to him over the years. So the film was released, it was a massive, massive hit all across the world. And on June 27th, 1982, for US President Ronald Reagan. Spielberg was in attendance. There was a number of distinguished guests there, including Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And here's where we go down the rabbit hole now. I want to talk about this Hollywood television producer called Jamie Shandera, who's involved with this Japanese documentary about Steven Spielberg following the release of E.T. During the filming, Shandera was told a curious story by Spielberg. Apparently, after the screening of the film, at the White House, President Reagan leaned over and quietly commented to Spielberg, and this is documented it's actually quoted in Grant Cameron's article. I'm going to refer to a number of articles by Grant Cameron because he's an excellent researcher on this subject. As a matter of fact, if it hadn't been for the research of Grant Cameron, much of what's in this video it wouldn't be known, it wouldn't be talked about. So we get this article, Grant Cameron, a young Steven Spielberg meets the president. So he leans over, allegedly, Reagan leaned over to Spielberg and said, "You know, there aren't 6 people in this room who know how true this really is." Now, Ronald Reagan had a fascination with UFOs and ETs. Allegedly, he did actually see one in his life. And Reagan would quite often incorporate this notion of extraterrestrial life into any number of public addresses that he gave around the world.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There's one account where Reagan actually brought up the subject with Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of Russia at the time. And this was towards the end of the so-called Cold War. And Gorbachev once recounted the following discussion in a meeting in Geneva. So this is taken from A. Hovney's September 1988 UFO Universe article, "The Shocking Truth, Ronald Reagan's Obsession with an Alien Invasion." Quote, "The US president said that if the Earth faced an invasion from extraterrestrials, the United States and the Soviet Union would join forces to repel such an invasion. I shall not dispute the hypothesis, although I think it's early yet to worry about such an intrusion." Quote, that's unquote. That's from Gorbachev. And over the years, a number of journalists and researchers have tried to pin Spielberg down on this subject. They've tried and failed actually to coax a more detailed confirmation out of Spielberg. Publicly, he's always downplayed this narrative that Reagan said what he said when he took the film to show it to the White House. And generally, he would always say that Reagan was just joking about it. However, again, it's thanks to the researcher Grant Cameron on this matter. And this article, "New Hollywood Director Confirms Steven Spielberg's UFO Story." So the article says, "Years ago, I posted a story that Ronald Reagan had told Steven Spielberg in 1982 during the screening of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a stunning revelation. Attempts to get Spielberg to confirm the Reagan revelation was unsuccessful. During the 2008 X conference, I was contacted by a filmmaker who stated that a prominent Hollywood figure had told her a similar story, and that this director claimed to have gotten the statement from Spielberg directly. We discussed what had been posted, and the film producer stated that she would be in California and would ask the director again to confirm what Steven Spielberg had stated. On May 30th, the filmmaker emailed me back. She wrote, I was in Hollywood a couple of weeks ago and had lunch with my Hollywood producer friend who had worked with Spielberg and told me a version of your story. I took the printout from your website for him to review, and he concurred that it was just as he remembered Steven Spielberg recount it. Now, there's a lot of speculation about Steven Spielberg, whether he really was the sort of person who was trying to whistleblow on certain subjects in the early parts of his career. It's true to say that he was a maverick in the industry. He hung around with the likes of George Lucas, who was another guy who was anti-Hollywood establishment at the time, bucked the trends and the way things worked in the industry. So he wasn't averse to talking about subjects that people in the mainstream of Hollywood generally didn't want to talk about. for fear of the repercussions, basically. But it's throughout the late 1980s and 1990s that Spielberg began to shift his personal value systems, for want of a better way of putting it, and he eventually became very pro-establishment, very Hollywood. I'm going to very briefly speculate here on why that might have been. There was a documentary made a number of years ago about Spielberg's life, and in it he talked about his relationship and marriage to the actress Kate Capshaw. And I've often wondered if that change had something to do with her. There is this thing that's called the Yoko factor. It refers to how Yoko Ono influenced John Lennon in the Beatles, and some people have said that it steered him away from the Beatles and changed his interests and his views on life, made him much more politicised and all that kind of thing. And there's possibility here that that might have been the case with Kate Capshaw, because there are claims that Kate Capshaw might have been, allegedly, I must put that word in there, a handler or a steerer of Spielberg. If you look into some of the themes of her films that she was involved with, Dreamscape, psychotronic mind control type subject. You had Indiana Jones the Temple of Doom, which has got slavery, occultism and mind control in it. You had Space Camp, which was a NASA PR child programming and entrainment type thing. You know, the list goes on and on. So that might just be coincidental, but a lot of these things crop up in the films that she was involved with. But by Spielberg's own admission, it was in the aforementioned documentary about Spielberg's life, it was Capshaw that ignited Steven Spielberg's familial religious cultural heritage. In this case, it was Judaism during the latter part of the 1980s, and that happens to be, coincidentally, as you might think, who knows, that happens to be precisely at the time when Spielberg's shift happened. It should be noted that Spielberg has received a number of distinguished service awards, the Liberty Award, a knighthood from the Queen. Let's also consider the involvement of Spielberg with the US military in the years since. Notable example there is 2005's War of the Worlds, and Spielberg was involved, even if he wasn't actually necessarily a director, he was involved in the production side of films. A lot of films that involved the ET UFO subject, and that film War of the Worlds is what I would consider one of his first overtly negative portrayals of extraterrestrial life in film. So we have a shift there as well, albeit a few years after Hollywood's Spielberg's move towards the establishment fully. So I've always thought that it was telling. Spielberg's had such a huge influence over Hollywood, particularly in the alien subject in films. If you go into the subgenre of Hollywood of ET UFOs films, it continues to dominate the bulk of the cinematic output. Even now in the 21st century, you know, and many of the highest grossing films of all time they've either been directed by Spielberg, or he was a producer on the film, or he's involved in some form, Amblin production company that he was involved with. There's a lot of connections to Spielberg, and you know, even if it's just in an executive production role. So the evidence seems to indicate that Spielberg's position of impartiality and open-mindedness, that would be a thing of the past now. And it's a shame, really, because whatever people might think about this matter, whether people think that Spielberg always was really in the arms of the establishment or not, there was something very positive that was coming across from these films. One final thing that I want to note here is people might be thinking that I'm saying that what Reagan was saying, you know, he believed in all this kind of thing, and it's something that a lot of alternative knowledge researchers bring up. It goes back to the matter of Reagan saying what he did, and the fact that Reagan quite often addressed this issue of extraterrestrials visiting Earth, extraterrestrials invasions and stuff like that coming to the Earth and that. And he did this in a lot of these things, United Nations types talks and things like that, and addresses and things like that. But what you will quite often find in these addresses that he gave, he also brings up the subject of globalism, and on a number of occasions mentions the New World Order. Now, a lot of people out there might be watching this and might go, oh, New World Order, scoff, that kind of thing. But we have to wonder if Reagan wasn't bringing the ET UFO subject into these addresses to rally the troops, for want of a better way of putting it, rally the people to get behind this idea of a one world government, for want of a better way of putting it. So if you have a threat, an external threat, or an internal threat, as we've found over the last few years, that often can be the way that globalist types, elite types in the world, can advance their agendas. And Reagan was very well connected with these people. He was a part of that establishment that was trying to advance these various agendas around the world. So I've often wondered if the reality of that quote was what that was all about. And if we consider the fact that Spielberg, certainly now is establishment, but may always have been establishment, Spielberg himself might have been even unwittingly, but Spielberg might even have put that out there to bolster this potential agenda that might have been there with what Reagan was trying to do. I think it's always important to address these ideas. I think it's always important to put these ideas out there for consideration, but I will leave that one for you to decide. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please consider like, sharing and subscribing to the channel. You can also check out my alternative knowledge research books. They're available in the links in the description to this video. They're available on Amazon and Lulu Publishing, and I will see you again soon. Bye bye for now.